Welcome to Life Stories, where every tale uncovers the beauty of human connection and the profound lessons life has to offer. Today, we journey with Ethan Carter, a billionaire who seemingly has it all but discovers there's something missing, a piece of his family's forgotten past. When a young boy's innocent words spark a chain of events, Ethan embarks on a path of discovery, love, and reconciliation. What unfolds is a story of healing and the unbreakable bonds of family. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories as we begin today's heartfelt tale. Let's dive into the journey together. The grand ballroom of the Hudson Hotel in Manhattan was a world unto itself that evening. Light spilled from crystal chandeliers, their facets casting intricate patterns onto the polished floors. The air was thick with the scent of roses and gardenias, their arrangements dotting the space like jewels. Guests mingled, their laughter and chatter blending with the soft strains of a live orchestra playing in the corner. Everywhere you looked, there were polished tuxedos, glittering evening gowns, and champagne flutes held aloft in a delicate dance of refinement. Ethan Carter stood at the heart of it all. Tall and composed, he wore his success as naturally as his perfectly tailored suit. His dark hair, carefully styled, seemed to catch the ballroom's golden light, and his piercing blue eyes scanned the crowd with a practiced gaze. He was a man accustomed to admiration and awe, a billionaire who had built an empire not just on financial acumen but on charm and vision. Yet tonight, he wasn't just a figure of wealth, he was a man of purpose, a beacon for those in need. As the chatter hushed, Ethan stepped onto the stage, his presence commanding but warm. He paused at the podium, allowing the stillness to settle. Then, his voice filled the room, rich and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here tonight. Your presence is not just a testament to your generosity but to your commitment to making a difference." His words wove through the crowd, resonating deeply with all who listened. He spoke of the importance of education, of healthcare, and of the transformative power of community. He painted vivid pictures of the lives they could change together, each sentence carrying a weight of conviction. Applause thundered in response, and for a moment, the air felt electric with hope. Yet, amidst the applause, a peculiar sensation prickled at the back of Ethan's mind, a feeling of being watched. But not in the way he was accustomed to. It wasn't admiration or awe but something gentler, something more curious. His eyes scanned the room, brushing over faces until they landed on a small figure at the edge of the crowd. It was a boy, no older than 8, with tousled brown hair and wide, curious eyes that sparkled with the innocence of youth. He wore a simple outfit, his small frame almost swallowed by the grandeur of the event. He didn't belong here, not in the midst of tuxedos and evening gowns. Yet there he stood, his gaze fixed intently on Ethan, unshaken by the sea of adults around him. As the event continued, Ethan's thoughts kept drifting back to the boy. Who was he? How had he found his way into this world of opulence and charity? When the crowd began to disperse, Ethan descended the stage, and without quite knowing why, he found himself gravitating toward the boy. The boy noticed him approaching and tugged at the sleeve of his jacket. "Hey, sir," he said, his voice clear and innocent, standing out against the fading hum of the gala. "My dad has a birthmark just like yours." The words stopped Ethan in his tracks. His polished smile faltered for a moment as a strange mix of emotions rushed through him: curiosity, disbelief, and a pang of something deeper. Something he couldn't yet name. Instinctively, he glanced at his own forearm, where a dark, crescent-shaped birthmark had been since the day he was born. It was a feature so ordinary to him that he rarely thought of it. And yet this child's words had suddenly cast it in a new light. Ethan crouched down to the boy's level. His curiosity piqued. "Really?" he asked, his tone soft and inviting. "What does your dad's birthmark look like?" The boy's face lit up with excitement. "It's like a little moon. Just like yours," he said, forming a crescent shape in the air with his hands. "I always thought it was cool." It makes us special. Right. Ethan couldn't help but smile at the boy's enthusiasm. Yes, he said, nodding. It does make us special. There was a pause. A heartbeat of shared understanding. What's your name? Buddy. Jake, the boy replied proudly. I'm here with my dad. He said I could come see the important people. Are you an important person? The question, so simple yet profound, caught Ethan off guard. He chuckled softly, the sound breaking through the tension that had inexplicably settled in his chest. I guess you could say that, he replied, his voice tinged with humility. But you know what? The most important people are the ones who care about others. Just like you and your dad. Jake's eyes widened with admiration. I want to help people too. Just like you. The sincerity in Jake's voice struck a chord deep within Ethan, awakening memories of a time when he had harbored similar dreams before the weight of ambition and responsibility had clouded them. There was something about this boy, something in his earnest gaze and innocent words, that stirred a part of Ethan he had almost forgotten. The noise of the gala began to swell again, drawing Ethan's attention back to the room. He glanced around, realizing their moment was slipping away. Rising to his feet, he ruffled Jake's hair gently. Be good, Jake, he said with a warm smile. And don't forget to help your dad too. I will, Jake promised, his smile brighter than ever. Maybe one day we can help people together. As the boy turned to rejoin his father, Ethan's gaze followed him, his thoughts swirling. Who was Jake's father? What stories lay behind the boy's innocent proclamation? The questions lingered in the air, refusing to be dismissed. The evening wore on, and the gala continued as planned. Yet, for Ethan, everything felt different. The boy's words had planted a seed of curiosity, one that was quickly growing into something more, a yearning to understand, to uncover the truth about a connection he had never anticipated. As the music and laughter swirled around him, Ethan found himself standing at the crossroads of a journey he had not chosen but knew he could not ignore. That night, as he left the ballroom and stepped into the cool Manhattan air, the city's lights seemed dimmer, the grandeur of his life quieter. Jake's words echoed in his mind, pulling him toward a past he had long buried. It was a path shrouded in mystery, but for the first time in years, Ethan felt compelled to follow it. Little did he know, the boy's innocent remark was the beginning of a journey that would unravel the very fabric of his identity and reshape the legacy he thought he understood. The following morning, Ethan Carter sat in his penthouse overlooking the Manhattan skyline. The city stretched out before him, its towers glinting in the early light. But his thoughts were far from the business deals and meetings that usually occupied his mind. Jake's words from the previous evening echoed in his head, refusing to let go. My dad has a birthmark just like yours. Ethan had replayed the moment countless times, from Jake's wide-eyed curiosity to the way the boy's small hands had formed a crescent in the air. It wasn't just the words themselves, it was the strange familiarity they awakened in him. A thread tugging at something buried deep in his past. For someone like Ethan, whose life was meticulously planned and organized, the encounter had left an uncharacteristic ripple of uncertainty. He couldn't let it rest. There had to be more to this connection, something waiting to be uncovered. The boy, Jake, and his father, David Harper. Where had they come from? And how did their lives intertwine with his? Ethan found himself scrolling through the list of attendees from the charity gala. It was something he rarely did. Most names on such lists were familiar faces in the world of philanthropy and business. Yet this time, he was looking for someone specific. Finally, he found it, David Harper. The name leaped off the screen, carrying with it a sense of familiarity Ethan couldn't quite place. A quick search revealed little about David. He wasn't a prominent figure in business or society, but what he did find struck him as significant. David Harper was listed as living in a small town in Vermont. Ethan's breath caught. Vermont. Of all places. A flood of memories rushed back to him. Ethan had spent the early years of his childhood in a quiet town in Vermont. A place called Willow Creek. It had been a world far removed from the glitz and power. He now commanded a world of sunlit fields, family dinners, and laughter that seemed so simple, so pure. But it was also a world he had left behind after tragedy had struck his family, severing ties and casting long shadows over his memories. Could it be coincidence? Or was there something more? The idea lingered, stubborn and insistent. Ethan knew he couldn't ignore it. He needed to know more about David Harper and his connection to Willow Creek. But how? The thought of reaching out directly felt too forward, too intrusive. Instead, he decided on a more subtle approach. "Alexa, call Victor," he said aloud, addressing his assistant. Victor had worked with Ethan for years, overseeing everything from event logistics to background checks. If anyone could discreetly find out more about David Harper, it was Victor. The phone rang twice before Victor picked up. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," he said in his usual crisp tone. "What can I do for you?" Ethan hesitated for a moment, then spoke. "Victor, I need you to look into someone for me. His name is David Harper. He attended the gala last night with his son, Jake." "Of course," Victor replied without missing a beat. "Anything in particular you're looking for? I just need to understand more about him, where he's from, what he does, and if you can, see if there's any connection to Willow Creek, Vermont." There was a pause on the line. "Willow Creek?" Victor asked, his tone tinged with surprise. "Yes," Ethan said, his voice firm. "I'll explain later. Just see what you can find." As the call ended, Ethan felt a strange mixture of anticipation and apprehension. It wasn't often that he delved into his own past. His focus had always been on the future, on building and achieving. Yet now, the prospect of unraveling these threads from his childhood filled him with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. By late afternoon, Victor had sent him a detailed report. David Harper, it turned out, did indeed have ties to Willow Creek. He had grown up there, only a few streets away from the house where Ethan had spent his early years. The two men had likely crossed paths as children, though neither would have known it at the time. Even more compelling was what Victor had uncovered about David's family. David's father, Thomas Harper, had been a close friend of Ethan's uncle, Thomas Carter. The connection between their families seemed undeniable. Though the details were murky, there were hints of a falling out, whispers of a tragedy that had driven them apart. Ethan's heart raced as he read the report. The birthmark, the connection to Willow Creek, the overlapping family histories, it all felt too significant to ignore. The name Thomas Carter, in particular, struck a deep chord within him. His uncle had been a figure of both warmth and mystery in Ethan's life. A man whose absence had left a hole Ethan had never quite filled. There was one detail in Victor's report that stood out above the rest. David Harper had a son, Jake, who bore an uncanny resemblance to Ethan when he was a boy. The thought left Ethan breathless. Could Jake be more than just a stranger's child? Was it possible that they shared more than a birthmark? The questions swirled in his mind, each one more urgent than the last. He knew what he had to do. The next day, Ethan booked a private flight to Vermont. The thought of returning to Willow Creek filled him with both excitement and dread. He hadn't been back in decades, and the idea of walking those familiar streets again felt like opening a door to a room he'd long ago locked away. But he couldn't turn back now. There was something waiting for him in that small town, a truth that had been buried for years, just waiting to be uncovered. Ethan didn't know where the journey would lead him, but he was ready to take the first step. For the first time in years, his heart felt alive, beating with the anticipation of discovery. The threads of his past were pulling him home, and he was determined to follow them, no matter where they led. The plane touched down on the small airstrip just outside Willow Creek, Vermont. As the late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the landscape, Ethan Carter stepped out. Inhaling deeply, the air here was different, crisp, clean, and tinged with the faint scent of pine. It was a stark contrast to the sharp, bustling atmosphere of Manhattan. Yet, as serene as it seemed, this place carried a weight for Ethan, a mix of nostalgia and unease. Driving through town, memories began to unfold with every turn of the wheel. Willow Creek hadn't changed much in the decades since Ethan had last seen it. The main street was still lined with its quaint shops and cafes, their facades slightly weathered but still familiar. A bookstore stood where it always had, its sign faded but comforting in its permanence. Children played in the small park near the town center. Their laughter carried on the breeze. It was as if time had slowed here, preserving the charm and simplicity Ethan remembered so well. But there were shadows too, lingering at the edges of his thoughts. The last time he had been in Willow Creek was after the tragedy that had upended his family's life, his uncle's sudden death, followed by a rift no one had ever fully explained. His parents had shielded him from the details, and over time, the questions had faded, buried under the demands of his ever-growing ambitions. Until now, Ethan's first stop was the house where he had spent his childhood summers. It stood at the edge of a quiet street, its once vibrant exterior now faded and worn. The garden, once meticulously kept by his mother, was overgrown with wildflowers and weeds. Yet, despite its neglected state, the house seemed alive with memories. Stepping out of the car, Ethan hesitated. The sight of the house brought a lump to his throat. He could almost hear the echoes of his childhood, the laughter of his cousins, the clinking of dishes as the family gathered for dinner, the warmth of his uncle's voice as he told stories by the fireplace. He pushed the creaky front gate open and walked up to the porch. The door, weathered and peeling, felt heavy as he pushed it inward. Dust motes danced in the golden light streaming through the windows, and the air smelled faintly of age and abandonment. Each step he took seemed to unearth a memory, vivid and bittersweet. As he wandered through the rooms, his thoughts turned to his uncle, Thomas Carter. He had been larger than life to Ethan, a man of kindness and quiet strength. Yet, beneath that warmth, there had always been a hint of sadness, a weight that Ethan had been too young to understand. The last time Ethan had seen him, his uncle had hugged him tightly, whispering, "Take care of your family, Ethan. That's what matters most." Those words had stuck with him, though their meaning had always felt elusive. Now, they seemed to take on a new significance, as if his uncle had known the family would fracture and that Ethan would one day have to piece it back together. Ethan's musings were interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the porch. He turned to see an elderly woman standing in the doorway, her silver hair pulled into a neat bun. She wore an apron dusted with flour and carried an air of gentle curiosity. "You're back, aren't you?" she said, her voice soft but steady. Yes," Ethan replied, surprised. "I used to live here as a child. My name is Ethan Carter." Her face lit up with recognition. "Carter. Of course, I remember you. Dear. You were just a boy when you left. Your mother used to bring you here every summer." Ethan smiled faintly. "It's been a long time. I didn't expect the house to still feel so familiar." The woman stepped inside, her gaze sweeping over the room with a wistful expression. "This house holds memories, good ones and hard ones alike. Your uncle, Thomas, was a fine man. It was a tragedy." "What happened?" Ethan's heart quickened. "What do you mean? What happened to him?" The woman hesitated, her gaze drifting to the floor. "It's not my story to tell, dear. But there was a lot of pain. Your uncle was loved, but he carried a burden, one that strained the family in ways you might not understand." Ethan leaned forward, his voice gentle but insistent. "Please, anything you can tell me might help. I'm trying to understand my family, especially my uncle's connection to David Harper." The woman's eyes widened slightly at the name. "David Harper? That's a name I haven't heard in a while. He was part of the neighborhood too, wasn't he? His family and yours were close once. But after the accident, things changed." What accident? Ethan asked, his pulse quickening. She sighed, her expression heavy with the weight of old memories. There was a car crash. Your uncle was killed. And there were whispers about a child, but no one wanted to talk about it. People in small towns prefer to let the past rest. Especially when it's painful. Ethan's mind raced. A child? Could she mean David Harper or someone connected to him? The questions burned in his mind. But the woman seemed reluctant to say more. If you're looking for answers, she said finally, you might want to talk to David Harper himself. He lives not far from here. In a white house at the end of Sycamore Lane. But be careful. Ethan. Some truths are harder to bear than the questions. Ethan thanked her, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. As he left the house, the golden light of the setting sun seemed dimmer. The road ahead felt both clearer and more daunting. A path paved with the fragments of a history he was determined to piece together. The sun had begun to set as Ethan Carter made his way down Sycamore Lane, the faint rustle of leaves accompanying his thoughts. The houses here were modest, each with its own story etched into peeling paint and weathered fences. At the very end of the lane stood a white house, its picket fence slightly crooked. But the lawn was neatly trimmed. A swing hung from a tree in the yard, swaying gently in the breeze. A quiet reminder of childhood innocence. Ethan took a deep breath as he approached the door. His heart pounded, not with fear, but with anticipation. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together. Yet so many questions remained unanswered. Who was David Harper? And what connection did he and his son, Jake, have to Ethan's family? He raised his hand and knocked. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the sound of footsteps approached, and the door opened to reveal a man in his early 40s. David Harper was tall, with a rugged handsomeness that spoke of a life lived fully, though not without its challenges. His sharp eyes took in Ethan's tailored coat and confident posture with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Can I help you?" David asked, his voice steady but guarded. Ethan extended a hand. "David Harper. Right. My name is Ethan Carter. I believe we may have a shared history. I'd like to talk. If you have a moment." David hesitated, glancing past Ethan as if gauging whether this was some elaborate prank or an uninvited intrusion. Finally, he nodded and stepped aside. "Come in." The interior of the house was warm and inviting. Family photos lined the walls, pictures of Jake at various stages of his young life, always with a bright smile that tugged at Ethan's heart. There was a lived-in comfort to the space. From the worn couch to the faint smell of coffee lingering in the air, David motioned for Ethan to take a seat at the kitchen table, where a half-empty cup of tea sat cooling. He leaned against the counter, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "So, what's this about?" Ethan took a moment to gather his thoughts. "I met your son, Jake, at the gala in Manhattan a couple of days ago. He mentioned something unusual. He said you have a birthmark like mine." David's brow furrowed slightly, though he said nothing. Ethan continued, his tone steady. "It's not just that. I grew up here in Willow Creek, not far from this very street. My family, well, we had ties to this place. And I think those ties may include you and your family." For a long moment, David simply stared at him, his eyes narrowing as he processed Ethan's words. Then, he pulled out a chair and sat across from him, his posture still tense. "You're talking about Thomas Carter, aren't you? Your uncle." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "You knew him?" David nodded slowly. "I did. He was my father's closest friend. Almost like a brother. But after the accident, everything fell apart. My family, we moved on. Or at least, we tried to." "The accident?" Ethan repeated. "I've heard whispers about it. But no one ever told me the full story. What happened?" David let out a long breath, rubbing the back of his neck. "It was a car crash. My father and your uncle were together that day. They were driving back from a trip when something went wrong on the road. Your uncle didn't survive. My father, well, he walked away from it. But he was never the same. Ethan felt the weight of the words settle over him. He had always known his uncle's death was sudden. But hearing the details made it all the more real. I had no idea, he said quietly. My family never talked about it. They just moved on. Like you said. David gave a bitter laugh. Moving on doesn't mean forgetting. My dad carried that guilt for years. It changed him. Changed all of us. The room fell silent for a moment. The shared grief of their families hanging between them. Then Ethan leaned forward. His voice softer now. David. Jake said something else. He said your birthmark looks just like mine. And from what I've learned, it's a trait that runs in our family. Are we connected? David's expression shifted. A flicker of recognition crossing his face. The birthmark, he murmured. Almost to himself. My dad had it too. He used to call it our family's mark. Like it was some badge of honor. But he never talked about where it came from. I always thought it was just a quirk of genetics. Ethan nodded. His pulse quickening. It's not just genetics. It's more than that. I think it's a thread connecting us, a sign that we're part of the same story. The same family. David looked away. His jaw tightening. If that's true, then why did no one ever tell me? Why was my family kept in the dark? I don't know. Ethan admitted. His voice tinged with regret. But I want to find out. And I think we can do it together. For the first time. David's posture softened. And the guarded look in his eyes began to fade. You really think there's something here? Something worth digging into? I do. Ethan said firmly. For Jake's sake. For both of us. Don't you want to know the truth? David hesitated. Then nodded. All right, he said quietly. Let's find out what's been buried all these years. As they began to talk. Sharing fragments of their memories and piecing together the stories of their families. Ethan felt a sense of connection he hadn't experienced in years. The barriers between them were beginning to dissolve. Replaced by a shared determination to uncover the truth. This wasn't just about solving a mystery, it was about reclaiming a history that had been lost. About building a bridge between the past and the future. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt that he wasn't alone in the journey. The next morning, the first rays of sunlight streamed through the lace curtains in David Harper's kitchen, illuminating the table where 2 cups of coffee sat untouched. Ethan and David had spent hours talking the previous night, trading fragmented memories of their families, trying to make sense of the pieces that didn't quite fit. The realization that they might be connected by more than coincidence had sparked a determination in both of them. Ethan had suggested taking their search deeper, to not only rely on memories but also uncover any tangible records that could confirm their shared history. David agreed. Albeit with a hint of reluctance. I've spent most of my life trying to move forward. Ethan, he had said. But maybe it's time to look back. Even if it hurts. And so, they found themselves driving down a winding country road toward Willow Creek's town archives. A modest brick building nestled between the library and the courthouse. The town seemed quieter than ever that morning. The streets almost empty save for a few early risers walking their dogs. As they stepped into the archives, the scent of old paper and polished wood enveloped them. A librarian with glasses perched low on her nose looked up from behind the counter. Good morning, she greeted them warmly. Can I help you with something? David hesitated, glancing at Ethan for reassurance. Ethan stepped forward. Yes. We're looking for any records involving the Carter or Harper families' birth certificates, property deeds. Anything that might give us some insight into their history here. The librarian nodded thoughtfully. That's quite a bit to dig through. But we do have old family files and public records in the back. You're welcome to take a look. Ethan and David exchanged a determined glance before following her to a room filled with towering shelves and carefully labeled boxes. The air was cooler here. The quiet punctuated only by the hum of a small fan in the corner. 4 hours. They sifted through documents, scanning faded pages and deciphering handwriting that was nearly as old as the town itself. They found small connections, mentions of shared events. Neighbors who had spoken fondly of the Carters and Harpers as close friends. But it wasn't until Ethan unearthed a yellowing newspaper article that everything began to fall into place. "Look at this," he said, sliding the paper across the table to David. The headline read, "Tragic accident claims local life." Beneath it was a photograph of a car wreck. And the accompanying article described the crash that had taken Ethan's uncle, Thomas Carter. What caught their attention, however, was the mention of David's father as the passenger. David's face tightened as he read aloud. Both men were prominent members of the community, known for their close friendship and shared business ventures. He paused, swallowing hard. "I didn't even know they were business partners. My dad never talked about that." Ethan leaned in, his gaze fixed on the article. "There's more. It says they were returning from a meeting about a joint venture, something involving a large plot of land outside town. Do you know anything about that?" David shook his head. "No. My dad never mentioned it. But it makes sense now. He always seemed burdened, like he was carrying more than just guilt about the crash." Their search continued, the puzzle becoming clearer with each discovery. Property records revealed that the land mentioned in the article had once been jointly owned by the Carter and Harper families. Birth certificates confirmed the presence of shared relatives, though the exact relationships were still unclear. But it was a handwritten letter, buried in a folder of unrelated documents, that struck the deepest chord. It was dated just weeks before the accident and signed by Thomas Carter. Ethan's voice trembled slightly as he read it aloud. "To my dearest brother-in-law, John Harper," it began. "I've thought long and hard about our plans and what they will mean for our families. I know we've had our differences, but I truly believe this venture will bring us closer. Not just as partners, but as brothers. There is too much at stake for us to let past wounds fester. For the sake of our children, let's make this work." David's eyes glistened as he listened. He was trying to mend things, he said quietly. But then the accident happened. And it all fell apart. Ethan nodded, his throat tight. "My parents must have buried this to protect us. They didn't want us to grow up with the weight of it all. But they didn't realize that by hiding it, they left us with even more questions." The two men sat in silence for a moment, the enormity of what they had uncovered sinking in. The connection between their families wasn't just one of shared loss, it was one of unspoken reconciliation. A bond that had been cut short before it could truly heal. "What do we do now?" David finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan took a deep breath. "We keep going. We find out everything we can. Not just for us, but for Jake. He deserves to know where he comes from, to understand the legacy we share." David nodded, a flicker of determination returning to his eyes. "You're right. And maybe we can finally give our families the closure they never had." As they left the archives, the weight of the past felt both heavier and lighter. Heavier because of the truths they had unearthed, but lighter because they were no longer carrying it alone. Together, they were beginning to bridge the gap between two fractured families. Piece by piece, one discovery at a time. The morning sun was high in the sky now, casting long shadows on the quiet streets. But for Ethan and David, the path ahead was clearer than it had been in decades. And for the first time, it felt like they were walking it not as strangers, but as family. As Ethan and David stepped out of the archives, the warmth of the midday sun contrasted sharply with the weight of the discoveries they had made. The town of Willow Creek seemed unchanged around them, its streets as quiet and unassuming as ever. But for Ethan and David, everything had shifted. The puzzle pieces they had uncovered in the archives had given them a glimpse of a deeper connection between their families, a bond forged not just by blood, but by shared dreams, tragedies, and unspoken reconciliations. Back at David's house, they spread out the documents they had gathered on the kitchen table. Property deeds, birth certificates, and the letter from Thomas Carter were placed side by side, forming a mosaic of their intertwined histories. Ethan found himself staring at the letter again, rereading the words that carried so much hope and longing. For the sake of our children. Let's make this work, he murmured aloud, his voice tinged with emotion. David, who had been silent for a while, finally spoke. I keep thinking about how different things could have been if that accident hadn't happened. Maybe our families would have stayed close. Maybe Jake would have grown up knowing your side of the family, and you would have known us. Ethan looked up, his eyes meeting David's. We can't change what happened, he said softly, but we can make sure that moving forward, Jake knows exactly where he comes from, and so do we. David nodded, though his gaze lingered on the birth certificates. You know, it's strange, he said, his voice distant. I grew up feeling like something was missing, like there was a part of my family I couldn't reach. My dad tried his best, but there was always this sadness in him. This sense that he'd lost something he couldn't get back. I never understood it until now. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his thoughts drifting to his own parents. My parents were the same. They rarely talked about my uncle after the accident. It was like he became a ghost in our family, a memory too painful to touch. He paused, taking a deep breath. But now, I see that by trying to protect us from the past, they only made the gap wider. For a moment, silence settled between them, heavy with unspoken understanding. Then the sound of footsteps interrupted their thoughts. Jake appeared in the doorway, his face lighting up when he saw Ethan. Hey, you're still here, he exclaimed, running into the room. Ethan smiled, the boy's energy cutting through the somber mood. Of course I'm still here. We've been talking about some pretty important stuff. Jake climbed into a chair next to Ethan, his wide eyes darting to the papers on the table. What's all this? He asked curiously. David hesitated, glancing at Ethan. Jake, he began carefully. You know how you said Mr. Carter's birthmark looks like mine? Jake nodded enthusiastically. Yeah. It's so cool. Like you're part of the same club or something. David smiled faintly. Well, it turns out you might be right. Mr. Carter, Ethan, is family. His part of our story. Jake's eyes widened, his gaze shifting between his father and Ethan. You mean, like cousins or something? Something like that, Ethan said with a chuckle. We're still figuring it all out. But yes, Jake, we're family. The boy's face lit up with wonder. That's awesome. Does this mean I have more cousins? Do you have kids? Mr. Carter? Ethan laughed, shaking his head. No kids yet, Jake. But I guess that means I'll just have to spoil you instead. Jake grinned, clearly thrilled at the idea. Can I tell my friends? They'll think it's so cool that I have a billionaire cousin. David and Ethan exchanged amused looks. Let's figure out the details first, David said, ruffling Jake's hair. But yes, you can tell your friends eventually. As Jake chattered on, his excitement filling the room, Ethan felt a warmth he hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't just the joy of discovering a connection, it was the realization that he had found something he hadn't known he was missing, a sense of belonging. For so long, his life had been defined by ambition and achievement, by building an empire that stood as a testament to his success. But now, sitting at a kitchen table in a modest house, surrounded by the beginnings of a family he was just starting to understand, he felt something deeper. David must have sensed it too. After Jake ran off to play in the backyard, David turned to Ethan, his expression serious. I've spent so many years trying to make sure Jake has a good life. But I've always felt like I wasn't giving him the whole picture. I didn't know how to explain our family's past because I didn't understand it myself. But now I feel like I can finally give him the answers he deserves. Ethan nodded. And it's not just for Jake. It's for us too. This isn't just about reconnecting with the past, it's about healing. David leaned back, a thoughtful look on his face. You know, he said after a moment, My dad used to say that family isn't just who you're born to, it's who you choose to hold on to. I didn't really get it back then. But now I think I do. Ethan smiled. Your dad was a wise man. And I think he'd be proud of the choices we're making now. The two men sat in companionable silence. The weight of their shared history finally starting to feel a little lighter. Outside, Jake's laughter echoed through the yard. A sound that seemed to carry with it the promise of a brighter future, a future where the bonds of family, once broken, could be rebuilt stronger than ever. For Ethan, the journey wasn't over. There were still questions to be answered, mysteries to unravel. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't facing it alone. Together, he and David would uncover the truths of their family's past. And in doing so, they would create a legacy not of pain, but of love, connection, and hope. As the evening sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose, Ethan stood at the edge of David's yard, watching Jake chase fireflies across the lawn. The boys' laughter echoed in the stillness, a reminder of the innocence and joy that had been rekindled through their journey. Ethan turned to David, who stood beside him, a quiet smile on his face. It feels like this is just the beginning, Ethan said. David nodded. It is. For Jake. For us. And for the family we're piecing back together. In that moment, Ethan felt a peace he hadn't known in years. He had spent so long building a legacy of wealth and success. But here, he had rediscovered something far more meaningful, the bonds of family, the power of forgiveness, and the hope for a brighter tomorrow. As the first stars appeared in the sky, Ethan made a silent promise to honor the past and cherish the future they were creating. If you enjoyed this story of love, family, and rediscovery, don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories for more heartfelt journeys. Each story brings you closer to the moments that truly matter. See you in the next video.